Hi guys, it's Debbie, and today I'm finally back with a good old review. Unfortunately, due to present circumstances, there haven't actually been that many new film releases. The few big movies that were supposed to reach cinemas have all been postponed to this winter, to the end of the year. But some have been made online, for example, The Invisible Man, a film which I loved and I would absolutely recommend. And the film I'd like to speak about today is one that has been released in the same manner. I'm speaking of Capone, starring Tom Hardy as the infamous villain Al Capone. Al Capone was a prominent gangster in Chicago during the early 1900s and who operated mostly during the Prohibition era, where alcohol was banned and mobsters would run that business illegally. But in addition to that, Capone was tied to all sorts of criminal activities. Basically anything you can imagine a mob leader to do. Now, most films on the topic portray Capone at the height of his activity, with the policeman breathing down his neck trying to frame him for his business. But there is hardly ever a portrayal of his life during the later years, when health issues took over to the point that he always needed assistance, he barely had control over his own body, let alone control illegal activities, illegal operations. His power at that point was definitely not the same. Even his family was starting to realise that further on they would have problems just for sharing the same last name. And this 2020 version of Capone is inspired by those events. It's not so much about police investigations and chases through the streets, but rather the figure of Capone in his private life and with his struggles. Now, Capone was one of the few films I was eagerly waiting to watch this year, and just as with The Invisible Man, watching Capone kind of made me feel like we were returning to cinemas. It made me feel like I was watching a proper big film, if that makes any sense. But instead of happily uniting the world of cinema lovers, this film split audiences in half. On the one hand, we had those who defend it as an unconventional approach to the gangster topic. On the other hand, we have those who complain about it being too boring, not engaging, and filled with more bodily functions rather than meaningful moments. I also assume that the comment section will be split between those who liked it and those who felt disappointed by it. So I'd love to hear your opinion on the topic, so remember to leave a comment down below. I personally enjoyed this film. I liked that it had an atypical approach to the topic, but I can see where all the criticism is coming from, and I definitely feel like in some points the plot could have dug a little deeper. There was a lot of space to expand. So if I have to sum up my viewing experience in one sentence, I was excited for the film, I enjoyed it, but it never went that extra mile. Let's start analysing the film from its star, Tom Hardy. Regardless of Hardy being in a variety of genres and with all kinds of roles, he is known for portraying villains. He has actually said that he enjoys portraying villains as there is often more to explore with them, the reasoning behind what they do, the moral implications, compared to a hero saving the day. And I think that that was the element that came through with this film. Capone was the most frightening mobster back at the time. His power was unmeasurable, but when his regime fell, he ended up just like one of us. Actually, because of his illness, he had to rely on other people. So he has this fancy house and fancy clothes and maids and housekeepers and guardians ready to do anything he orders, but at the same time, he is struggling to do the simple things. And you can see this is consuming him. He still feels like the lord he was, but can't express it anymore. Now, the main criticism that has been moved towards Tom Hardy in this film is that he doesn't look like Al Capone. Now, I personally don't believe even Robert De Niro looked particularly like Al Capone in The Untouchables. And in general, I think that when portraying a character, there is less of an attempt to make the actor identical to the character and more of an effort to convey an interesting rendition of that role. Otherwise, studios would just hire lookalikes, people who dedicate their life to imitating a famous person in their appearance, the way they talk, everything. I get that Hardy wasn't identical, but that was the smallest aspect of his portrayal. I loved how he conveyed all the smallest details of a person locked away in his mind, haunted by the ghosts of his past, paranoid about everybody around him, still trying to be in control of the situation, but barely in control of his own body, so eventually having to come to terms with his situation. Also, the film always offers the doubt about whether this is all just a big facade, an act put up to deter people from digging even more into his life. I do have one criticism towards his character. Well, let's say it's more of a doubt. I wonder if anybody can help to deny or confirm this. So, as many Italian Americans, When speaking, Capone and his family and friends often include sentences in Italian. This is a common situation you can see in everyday life, or even in films which also cover the theme of Italian-American heritage. A good example of this is The Godfather, in which although the sentences may be short and with a slight American accent, they're usually pretty correct. Whereas here in Capone, when the protagonist speaks Italian, it's often wrong. Words are inverted, the grammar is wrong, there are even terms which wouldn't be used in real life, and the accent is very, very strong. In some points, if there hadn't been subtitles, I wouldn't have had a clue what Tom Hardy was saying, and I'm Italian. Let's take again the example of The Godfather. As the films move on through the generations, the characters speak less and less Italian. Don Vito Corleone was born in Italy, he speaks pretty fluent Italian. His son Michael still speaks pretty good Italian, but he does prefer to use English. And when we get to the third film, with all the kids basically know some swear words and a few sentences, but still with a good pronunciation because they heard the words always pronounced correctly. That's a good presentation of how languages slowly fade away. Now here comes my doubt. Although Al Capone was American, he spoke English, he was of direct Italian descent. He spoke Italian in his family, he spoke Italian with his mother, and I'm pretty sure he was in an environment in which there was a heavy influence of Italian culture. So I assumed that he would have spoken the few Italian words he said correctly. I'm not speaking about the slur due to his illness, but most of what he says is forced. You can tell it's a foreigner trying to imitate what somebody else said, not somebody who grew up speaking Italian and just isn't as fluent as his parents. On the other hand, I'm thinking that with a film of this size, the research must have been pretty thorough, so that's why this is not a criticism, it's more of a wondering whether you know more about this, because it could be that Al Capone didn't really speak that much Italian. Now let's return back to the film in general. As a whole, I pretty much enjoyed this movie. I found again it was an interesting take on the subject. An aspect I loved was how it played with our emotions. In some scenes, I actually felt pretty sad for the protagonist, but then I would think, no, geez, he's a criminal who did terrible things. But then in the next scene, I'll think, well, after all, it's still his family, he has to get to enjoy time with them. But then I'm like, no, he got to all that wealth through illegal things. The whole plot juggles with our emotions. Even without a mind-blowing story, it's mostly just Capone and what's going on in his mind. The plot is not about his high-risk operations, it's him reduced to dealing with barely having control over his body. It's actually pretty sad in many moments. So of course, instead of having the Untouchables depiction of the story, with teams of policemen joining forces, trying to pinpoint where and how they could take Capone down, it's more of a where is he now? How his life evolved after that. And as a lover of gangster movies, I really appreciated how this was a totally different and unexpected approach to the genre, but still speaking about one of the most infamous gangsters of all time. But as I was mentioning earlier, many have criticised this film for being boring, lacking tension, not very engaging. I agree that the plot could have gone way deeper, especially because the protagonist's life is far from ordinary. There were some moments which were repetitive and could have been replaced with some more information about his life. The background to this film, what happened during Capone's life, is immense. And I'm thinking, how about all those who didn't even really know who Capone was, who might recognize his name as a name of a gangster, but don't really know where to place him, what he actually did. This film just offers a quick title card at the beginning and then jumps right into the plot set in the later years of the character's life. It's a bit hard for those who are unfamiliar with the topic to find their way throughout the plot. Usually when this happens, I bring up the example of All the Money in the World, about real events which happened during the 70s, but of course for somebody like me who was born much later, were totally unheard of. That film doesn't give for granted that just everybody in the audience knows what happened. It explains everything detail by detail. Now I'm not saying that this new Capone film had to do the same, but instead of certain repetitive moments, there was space for expansion. It could have filled those moments in with details about Capone's life. But as a whole, I eventually did enjoy this quieter version of his life, which in the end isn't exactly that quiet. Hardy's Capone is not De Niro's Capone walking down the steps of the hotel with fancy glasses and 20 bodyguards, but he's still a crazy king with the ghosts of his past and crocodiles and platypuses and hidden money and doctors and enemies and the Wizard of Oz. Let's take a look at Legend, another gangster film starring Tom Hardy not as one mobster, but as two criminal twins. Now, although there's a lot of action going on, most of the plot is about the two twins' personalities, their differences, how they organise their business, but also their personal life. There's not at the Departed or Gangs of New York level of physical action. Ironically, a big part of the plot is dedicated to their love lives because of how that aspect influenced their behaviour. I'm not saying that Capone is on the same level of Legend, but many films focus on the character's personality rather than all the action that went down. If again we want to draw a comparison with the Godfather films, although there is a lot of tension, a lot of high-stake moments, a great deal of the film concerns the characters discussing matters, making decisions, considering family issues. Of course, the tension that builds up is very different, the character analysis is not the same, the dialogues are better, everything is better in the Godfather films. But if you think about it, many of the best scenes don't rely on incredibly complicated action sequences. Or, on the contrary, take Gotti, one of the worst gangster films ever made. Again based on true events, with a lot of high-paced scenes, and it was absolutely awful. Some reviews have said that Capone is boring because at that point the protagonist was irrelevant. And I couldn't agree less, because although we're in the later years of his life, and of course he's not at the height of his power as he used to be, the police are still following his every step. Even his family has to choose what to do for their future just because of their last name. He definitely wasn't irrelevant, although in a negative manner. Could the plot have dug deeper into his personality, just as in the characters of Legend? Absolutely. Was it boring? Absolutely not. You also have to distinguish what your expectations of the film were and what the film actually presents. If you were expecting a Taken level of action, this is not the film for you. Then speaking of the secondary roles, all the people surrounding Capone are portrayed by pretty famous names. Linda Cardellini and Noel portray respectively his wife and his son, who love him very deeply, but of course are worried about the situation, are worried about the consequences of his actions. Then there are, for example, Matt Dillon, Kyle MacLachlan, Jack Lowden, in smaller secondary roles, but I believe that the best secondary character was definitely Capone's wife, the person always by his side and the one that was influenced the most by his lifestyle. So as we're reaching the end of this video, and because this film split audience opinions completely, I would highly recommend watching this film to form your own opinion on the matter. I enjoyed it, but I would have enjoyed it more with a few tweaks here and there. Now I'd love to hear your opinions on Capone, so make sure to leave a comment down below. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you soon in the next one. Bye.